On a busy Monday morning in downtown Miami, the marble halls of the district court buzzed with activity. The late summer heat pressed against the tall windows, but inside, the air conditioning kept everyone cool and professional. Judge Marcus Thompson sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's cases while straightening his black judicial robe. At 52 years old, Judge Thompson had earned his position through decades of hard work, starting as a public defender. As he flipped through the case files, one particular name caught his attention: Richard Collins, a prominent real estate developer known for his luxury condominiums along Miami Beach. The case seemed straightforward enough: multiple building code violations that potentially put residents at risk. However, something about Collins's previous court appearances made Judge Thompson pause. Outside in the courtroom, people began filling the wooden benches. Law clerks hurried back and forth, carrying stacks of papers. Court reporters set up their equipment, and the bailiff, Officer Martinez, conducted his usual security checks. The morning light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Officer Martinez's voice rang out clear and strong. "All rise. The Court of the Third District is now in session, the Honorable Judge Marcus Thompson presiding." The shuffle of people standing filled the room as Judge Thompson entered through the side door, his steps measured and dignified. As he took his seat at the bench, Judge Thompson observed the crowd before him. In the first row sat several worried-looking residents from Collins's buildings, clutching documents and whispering among themselves. Behind them were reporters from local news stations, their notebooks ready. The atmosphere felt charged with anticipation. Richard Collins arrived exactly 7 minutes late, dressed in an expensive gray suit that seemed to announce his wealth and status. He strode into the courtroom as if he owned it, barely acknowledging the proceedings already in progress. His attorney, a young man who looked fresh out of law school, hurried behind him with an overflowing briefcase. Judge Thompson noticed Collins's entrance but didn't immediately acknowledge it. Instead, he continued with the morning's preliminary matters, handling several quick cases with his usual efficiency. All the while, he could see Collins becoming increasingly agitated, checking his expensive watch and sighing loudly. When Collins's case was finally called, he sauntered up to the podium with an air of dismissal that immediately caught everyone's attention. His attorney tried to position himself properly, but Collins pushed slightly ahead, making it clear who was in charge of his defense. "Mr. Collins," Judge Thompson began, his voice clear and professional, "you stand before this court accused of multiple building code violations at your Ocean Drive properties. The allegations include faulty wiring, inadequate fire safety measures, and structural issues that pose significant risks to the residents." Before the judge could continue, Collins interrupted with a slight wave of his hand. "Look, Your Honor, if we could speed this up. I've got a meeting with some investors in an hour." The way he emphasized "Your Honor" carried a subtle note of mockery that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the courtroom. Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining neutral despite the clear disrespect. He had dealt with difficult defendants before, but something about Collins's attitude suggested this hearing might be different from the usual. The judge glanced down at the extensive documentation before him: photographs of exposed wiring, reports from building inspectors, and statements from concerned residents. One photo showed a cracked support beam in a parking structure, while another revealed fire exits that had been sealed off to create additional storage space. "Mr. Collins," Judge Thompson continued, maintaining his professional tone, "these violations are serious. We have documented evidence of at least 17 separate infractions, each of which could potentially endanger the lives of your tenants." Collins shifted his weight, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. His body language screamed defiance, and the tension in the courtroom began to rise. Even his young attorney seemed uncomfortable, trying unsuccessfully to get his client to adopt a more respectful posture. As Judge Thompson prepared to proceed with the hearing, he couldn't help but notice the way Collins kept looking around the courtroom, as if seeking approval for his behavior from the spectators. The judge had seen this type of attitude before: defendants who believed their money or status placed them above the law. Little did anyone know that this routine hearing was about to take an unexpected turn that would make headlines across the city. The tension in the courtroom grew as Judge Thompson began reviewing the evidence against Richard Collins. The judge carefully laid out each building code violation, his voice steady and professional as he described the dangerous conditions found in Collins's luxury apartments. The inspection report from September 15th shows exposed electrical wiring in the basement level, Judge Thompson stated, holding up photographs that clearly displayed the hazard. Additionally, the fire marshal's report indicates that emergency exits on floors 3 through 7 were deliberately blocked. Collins stood at the podium, his expensive suit jacket unbuttoned, displaying a gold watch that caught the fluorescent lighting. Instead of showing concern for the serious allegations, he kept checking his phone, barely paying attention to the proceedings. His young attorney nervously tried to get him to focus, but Collins brushed him off with an irritated wave. "Mr. Collins," Judge Thompson said firmly, "please put away your phone while in my courtroom." The judge's tone was patient but firm, the kind that came from years of experience dealing with difficult defendants. Collins looked up, his face showing a mixture of amusement and contempt. "Sure thing, Your Honor," he replied, driving out the word honor in a way that made it sound like a joke. "Whatever you say." He slipped the phone into his pocket but continued to smirk. Several spectators in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Among them were residents from Collins's buildings who had come to witness the proceedings. They exchanged worried glances as they watched their landlord's disrespectful behavior toward the judge. Judge Thompson continued, "The building inspector's report also indicates significant structural issues in the parking garage. The support beams show dangerous levels of deterioration." He held up another photograph, this one showing cracked concrete and exposed rebar. "Oh, come on," Collins interrupted, rolling his eyes. "Those pictures could be from anywhere. And anyway, my buildings are the most expensive in Miami Beach. If people don't like how I run them, they can move somewhere else." The judge's expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Collins, I remind you that building codes apply to all properties, regardless of their price point or location." Collins let out a short, sharp laugh. "Listen here," he said, leaning forward on the podium. "I've been in real estate longer than you've been playing judge. These regulations? They're just suggestions for people who can't afford good lawyers." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Collins's attorney turned pale, quickly trying to intervene. "Your Honor, if I could have a moment with my client." But Collins wasn't finished. He turned to the spectators, playing to the audience like he was on a stage. "You know what I think? I think His Honor here should stick to telling jokes. He's pretty funny, right? Like a comedian in a robe." The bailiff, Officer Martinez, took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. Judge Thompson raised his hand slightly, signaling the officer to stay where he was. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the usual sounds of paper shuffling and quiet whispers had ceased. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her eyes wide with disbelief. Judge Thompson sat perfectly still for a moment, his hands folded on the bench before him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the hushed room. "Mr. Collins, are you finished?" Something in the judge's tone made Collins's smirk falter slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Just trying to lighten the mood, Your Honor," he said, emphasizing the last two words with obvious sarcasm. "Isn't that what we're here for? Entertainment." The judge's face remained impassive, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes, the only visible sign of his controlled anger. He looked down at his papers for a long moment, then back at Collins. "Very well," Judge Thompson said, his voice carrying a weight that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter. "Given your apparent attitude toward these proceedings, I believe we need to take a brief recess." He picked up his gavel. "This court will reconvene in 15 minutes. As the gavel struck the sound block, Collins's attorney frantically tried to speak with his client, but Collins waved him off again. The defendant stood there, still smirking, apparently pleased with his performance. But those watching closely noticed Judge Thompson making several notes on his legal pad before rising from the bench. Notes that would soon prove very significant to the case's outcome. The 15-minute recess stretched into 20 minutes as tension built in the Miami courtroom. Richard Collins paced near the defense table, ignoring his attorney's desperate attempts to counsel him. The young lawyer's face was covered in sweat, his tie loosened as he watched his client's behavior spiral further out of control. When Judge Thompson finally returned to the bench, his demeanor had shifted subtly. There was a quiet intensity in his movements as he settled into his chair and arranged his papers. The courtroom fell silent, except for Collins, who was still muttering to himself near the defense table. "Mr. Collins," Judge Thompson began, "before we continue with the building code violations, I'd like to address your previous behavior in this courtroom." Collins straightened his expensive suit jacket and walked back to the podium, this time without his attorney. "Oh, now we're going to talk about behavior," he said loudly. "Like this is some kind of kindergarten class?" Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Officer Martinez, the bailiff, moved closer to the podium, his expression stern. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to record whatever came next. Judge Thompson leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Collins, I've reviewed your case history during our recess. This isn't the first time you've shown contempt for court proceedings. However, it will be the last time you do so in my courtroom." "Contempt?" Collins's voice rose sharply. "You want to talk about contempt? I built half the luxury properties in this city. I employ thousands of people, and I'm supposed to sit here and be lectured by—" He paused, his face reddening. "By what, Mr. Collins?" Judge Thompson's voice was dangerously quiet. "Please finish your statement." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Collins's attorney had his head in his hands, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. "By someone who's trying to be more than what he is?" Collins spat out. "This whole thing is a joke. You're a joke. Playing dress up in that robe doesn't change anything. You should be doing stand-up comedy, not pretending to be a real judge." The racial undertones of Collins's words hung heavy in the air. Several spectators gasped. A woman in the front row covered her mouth in shock. Even the court reporter paused for a moment, her fingers trembling over the keys. Judge Thompson sat perfectly still, his face a mask of calm that seemed to unnerve Collins more than any angry response would have. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, was probably only seconds. "Mr. Collins," the judge finally spoke, his voice level and controlled, "are you finished making a spectacle of yourself?" But Collins, caught up in his own anger and prejudice, wasn't done. "A spectacle? You want to talk about spectacles? This whole court is a spectacle. You sitting up there, acting all high and mighty. You know what? I've got better things to do than waste my time with this entertainment show." He turned to the gallery, spreading his arms wide like a performer on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, how's that for a performance? Should we all give the funny judge a round of applause?" Officer Martinez moved forward again, this time reaching for his handcuffs, but Judge Thompson raised his hand slightly, stopping him. The judge's calm demeanor had transformed into something else. A quiet, controlled anger that filled the room like an electrical charge. "Mr. Collins," Judge Thompson said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, "you seem to be laboring under several misconceptions. First, that your wealth places you above the law. Second, that your position in society allows you to disrespect this court. And third, most dangerously for you, that your racist implications will be tolerated in any way." Collins's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Judge Thompson continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. "You have made your position quite clear, Mr. Collins. Now I will make mine clear." The judge picked up his gavel, his grip tight but controlled. "This court will take another recess. When we return, you will either demonstrate appropriate respect for these proceedings, or you will face the full consequences of your actions." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. As Judge Thompson stood to leave, Collins remained at the podium, his previous bravado finally beginning to crack as he realized he might have gone too far. His attorney rushed forward, whispering urgently in his ear, but the damage was already done. The breaking point had been reached, and what would happen next would change both men's lives forever. In his private chambers, Judge Marcus Thompson sat at his desk, his hands folded calmly in front of him. The rich mahogany walls that had witnessed 15 years of judicial decisions now watched as he considered his next move. The sound of the courthouse clock ticking was the only noise breaking the silence. Through the window, he could see Miami's skyline, including several of Collins's controversial buildings stretching into the blue sky. The judge reached for a leather-bound book of state laws, though he already knew exactly what sections he needed to reference. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, maintaining his composure despite the morning's events. His clerk, Sarah Chen entered with a stack of files. Your Honor, I've pulled everything we have on Mr. Collins's previous court appearances, she said, placing the documents on his desk, including transcripts from 3 other judges who've handled his cases. Judge Thompson nodded, opening the first file. Thank you, Sarah. What's the mood in the courtroom? Tense, she replied. Collins is arguing with his attorney in the hallway. Several reporters have shown up after word got out about his behavior. She paused before adding, some of the residents from his buildings are still waiting. They look worried. The judge began reviewing the files methodically, his expression growing more serious with each page he turned. The documents revealed a pattern. Collins had shown similar disrespect in other courtrooms, though never quite as blatantly as today. 15 years on this bench, Judge Thompson said quietly, more to himself than to his clerk. I've seen all kinds of defendants, but this, he shook his head, then straightened in his chair. Sarah, please ask Officer Martinez to ensure everyone's ready. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes. After his clerk left, Judge Thompson stood and walked to the window. He straightened his robe, catching his reflection in the glass. His father's words from years ago echoed in his mind. Justice doesn't need anger to be effective. When he returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The earlier chaos had been replaced by an anticipatory silence. Collins sat at the defense table, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear. The developer's face still showed defiance, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. Judge Thompson took his seat, arranged his papers, and looked directly at Collins. Before we proceed, I want to make something absolutely clear, he began, his voice carrying authority without anger. This court exists not for entertainment, Mr. Collins, but for justice. He held up one of the files from his chambers. I have here documentation of your previous court appearances. A pattern emerges, one of disrespect, not just for the law, but for the very institution of justice. Collins shifted in his seat, but for once, remained silent. You seem to believe that your wealth and status place you above the law, Judge Thompson continued. That the rules governing our society are merely suggestions for you. This is not just incorrect, it's dangerous. The judge picked up another document. These building violations aren't just numbers on a page. They represent real risks to real people, your tenants, Mr. Collins. Families who trust that their homes are safe. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The courtroom remained absolutely silent. Now, we have 2 paths forward, Judge Thompson said, his voice level but firm. The first involves you demonstrating genuine respect for these proceedings and addressing these violations seriously. The second. He let the statement hang in the air. Collins's attorney quickly stood. Your Honor, if I may. My client wishes to apologize for his earlier behavior and requests the court's leniency. Judge Thompson raised his hand. Mr. Collins can speak for himself. In fact, I insist upon it. All eyes turned to Collins, who slowly stood. The smirk was gone from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. He cleared his throat, but before he could speak, Judge Thompson continued. Consider your next words very carefully, Mr. Collins. They will determine not only how we proceed with these building violations, but also whether you face additional charges for contempt of court and racial bias in a federal courthouse. The developer's face paled slightly as the full weight of his situation finally seemed to hit him. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Judge Thompson sat patiently, his presence commanding respect not through force or volume, but through dignity and unwavering adherence to the law. The next few moments would prove crucial, not just for Collins's case, but for setting a precedent in how the court would handle such behavior in the future. While the courtroom waited, Judge Thompson methodically reviewed the stack of documents his clerk had provided. The first file contained transcripts from a hearing 3 years ago, where Collins had faced similar building code violations. In that case, he had managed to avoid serious penalties through a series of legal maneuvers and last-minute repairs. The judge noted how Collins had made promises to the court that were never fully kept. Sarah Chen, the clerk, approached the bench with another file marked RGNT. Inside were statements from former employees of Collins's real estate company. Their testimonies described a pattern of cutting corners on safety measures and intimidating anyone who raised concerns. One former maintenance supervisor had documented repeated requests to fix faulty wiring, all of which have been ignored. Your Honor, Sarah whispered, pointing to a particular statement. This report shows Mr. Collins specifically targeted lower-income tenants in his buildings for neglect, assuming they wouldn't have the resources to fight back. Judge Thompson nodded gravely, his expression growing more concerned as he read through the evidence. He found photographs of mold-covered walls hidden behind fresh paint, inspection reports that have been altered, and documentation of bribes offered to local officials. Even more disturbing were the racial implications in Collins's business practices. The evidence showed that maintenance requests from minority tenants were consistently delayed or ignored, while similar requests from other tenants received immediate attention. The judge discovered a series of emails where Collins had mocked various court officials, including several racially charged comments about other judges he had encountered. These private communications revealed the true extent of his prejudices and his contempt for the legal system. Officer Martinez approached the bench with yet another document, a sealed record from a neighboring county. After reviewing it, Judge Thompson's eyebrows raised slightly. The record detailed an incident where Collins had attempted to intimidate a young African-American judge by filing false complaints and making veiled threats about knowing people in high places. The court reporter, who had worked in the Miami courthouse for over 2 decades, quietly shared her own observation. She had witnessed Collins's behavior in various courtrooms over the years, noting how his attitude grew more arrogant and disrespectful with each appearance. Looking through financial records, Judge Thompson found evidence of a troubling trend. Collins had systematically moved money between accounts just before inspections, creating the appearance of making repairs while actually pocketing the funds. The paper trail showed how he had built his real estate empire not through honest business practices, but through deception and exploitation. A social worker's report caught the judge's attention. It detailed the impact of Collins's negligence on families living in his properties. Children suffering from respiratory issues due to hidden mold, elderly residents trapped in their apartments because of broken elevators, and families living with dangerous electrical hazards. Sarah returned with one final file, a thick folder containing complaints that had never made it to court. Inside were dozens of letters from tenants who had tried to report problems but had been silenced through legal threats or economic pressure. Many of the letters came from immigrants and minorities who feared retaliation if they spoke up. Judge Thompson sat back in his chair, taking in the full scope of what he had discovered. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man who had built his success on exploitation, discrimination, and contempt for the law. Collins's behavior in court today wasn't an isolated incident. It was the public manifestation of a deeply rooted pattern. As the judge organized the documents, preparing to reconvene court, he noticed one last detail. A small news clipping from 15 years ago showed a younger Collins at a city council meeting, using the same dismissive and racially charged language he had displayed today. The article quoted him saying, "Some people just aren't meant to be in positions of authority." The irony of that statement, given the current situation, wasn't lost on Judge Thompson. He arranged the most crucial documents in order, each one representing a piece of the puzzle that would soon be revealed to the courtroom. The clock on the wall showed that 30 minutes had passed. Outside his chambers, he could hear the murmur of the waiting courtroom. Judge Thompson stood, straightened his robe, and gathered the files. The time had come to address not just Collins's contempt of court, but the years of systematic abuse and discrimination that had led to this moment. The courtroom doors opened as Judge Thompson made his way back to the bench. Officer Martinez's voice rang out clear and strong. "All rise." The shuffle of people standing filled the room, but there was something different in the air now, a sense of anticipation as everyone noticed the stack of files the judge carried with him. Richard Collins sat at the defense table, his previous arrogance noticeably diminished. His attorney had loosened his tie and was dabbing sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. The residents from Collins's buildings leaned forward in their seats, hoping for justice. "Be seated," Judge Thompson said, arranging the files before him. "Mr. Collins, please approach the bench with your attorney." As Collins walked forward, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor, Judge Thompson began laying out documents one by one on his bench, like cards in a game where he held all the winning hands. "Mr. Collins," the judge began, his voice steady and clear, "during our recess, I've reviewed some very disturbing information about your business practices and your history with the court system." He held up the first document. This is a maintenance report from 2023 showing systematic neglect of repairs in your properties, particularly in units rented by minority tenants. Collins shifted uncomfortably while his attorney quickly whispered something in his ear. Here, Judge Thompson continued, lifting another file, are statements from former employees detailing how they were instructed to ignore safety violations and threatened with termination if they reported problems. He looked directly at Collins. Would you like to explain this? Before Collins could respond, the judge picked up another document. This file contains evidence of altered inspection reports. The originals show serious safety violations, while the versions submitted to this court show passing grades. That's fraud, Mr. Collins. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Thompson methodically presented each piece of evidence. He showed photographs of dangerous conditions in Collins's buildings, read statements from intimidated tenants, and revealed financial records demonstrating misappropriated repair funds. But perhaps most troubling, Judge Thompson said, holding up a transcript, are your own words. Your communications show a pattern of discrimination and contempt for the legal system that extends far beyond your outburst today. Collins's face had grown increasingly pale. His attorney was frantically writing notes, but even he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. Your Honor, Collins finally spoke, his voice lacking its earlier swagger. I can explain. Yes, Mr. Collins, you will explain. Judge Thompson interrupted firmly. You will explain why you believed it acceptable to endanger the lives of your tenants. You will explain why you thought you could mock this court and its officials. And you will explain why you believed your wealth and status placed you above the law. The judge turned to address the entire courtroom. This court has a responsibility to ensure justice is served, not just in individual cases, but in protecting the fundamental principles of our legal system. He looked back at Collins. Your behavior today was not just an insult to this court, but a reflection of a deeper pattern of disrespect for the law and the people it protects. Judge Thompson began organizing the documents into neat piles. Before we proceed with sentencing for both the building violations and your contempt of court, I want to be absolutely clear about something. He paused, making sure he had Collins's full attention. The law applies equally to everyone in this courtroom, regardless of their wealth, status, or race. Your attempts to undermine this principle through discrimination, intimidation, and disrespect will not be tolerated. Collins's attorney stood up. Your Honor, we request a brief recess to discuss these new developments. Denied, Judge Thompson stated firmly. Your client has had ample opportunity to address these issues. Instead, he chose to treat this court as a stage for his prejudices. The judge picked up his gavel, looking at the now subdued developer. Mr. Collins, this court is prepared to deliver its ruling on both the building code violations and your contempt charges. However, given the evidence of fraud and discrimination we've uncovered, I am also referring this case to the federal authorities for further investigation. The courtroom tensed with anticipation as Judge Thompson prepared to announce his decision. The morning's drama was about to reach its conclusion, and everyone present knew they were witnessing a moment of true justice in action. Judge Thompson sat upright in his chair, the weight of his decision evident in his posture. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom windows as he prepared to deliver his ruling. Richard Collins stood at the defense table, his earlier bravado completely vanished. In the matter of the City of Miami versus Richard Collins, Judge Thompson began, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. This court has reached its decision regarding both the building code violations and the contempt charges. He lifted the first document from his bench. Regarding the building code violations, this court finds the defendant guilty on all 17 counts. The evidence clearly shows willful neglect of safety regulations that put hundreds of lives at risk. Collins's attorney started to object, but Judge Thompson raised his hand. The documentation is conclusive, Counselor. Your client's own records prove these violations. For these violations, the judge continued, this court imposes the following penalties. First, a fine of $100,000 for each violation, totaling $1.7 million. This money will be placed in a trust to make immediate repairs to all affected properties. Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom. Several of Collins's tenants exchanged hopeful glances. Second, Judge Thompson proceeded, Mr. Collins's real estate license will be suspended for a period of 1 year, during which time all his properties will be managed by a court-appointed administrator to ensure compliance with safety regulations. Collins slumped in his chair, the full impact of the ruling hitting him. His attorney frantically scribbled notes, already planning an appeal. Now, regarding the contempt charges and the evidence of discrimination we've uncovered, Judge Thompson's voice grew firmer. This court cannot and will not ignore the pattern of prejudice and disrespect demonstrated by Mr. Collins. The judge pulled out another document. For contempt of court, you are fined an additional $50,000. Furthermore, you are sentenced to 200 hours of community service to be served specifically in the communities you have discriminated against. Collins started to protest, but his attorney grabbed his arm, silencing him. This community service will include working with local housing advocacy groups and attending mandatory sensitivity training programs, Judge Thompson specified. You will learn firsthand about the impact of housing discrimination on families and communities. The judge then addressed the broader implications of the case. Additionally, Mr. Collins must establish a $500,000 fund for legal aid to assist low-income tenants in pursuing their rights in housing disputes. This fund will be administered by the Miami Legal Aid Society. He paused, looking directly at Collins. You will also issue formal written apologies to this court, to your tenants, and to the community members you have discriminated against. These apologies will be published in local newspapers at your expense. Judge Thompson shuffled his papers before delivering the final part of his ruling. Lastly, your properties will undergo monthly safety inspections for the next 5 years. Any future violations will result in immediate forfeiture of the properties to a community housing trust. The judge's voice took on an educational tone. This sentence serves multiple purposes: punishment for your violations, protection for your tenants, and most importantly, an opportunity for you to learn from your mistakes and make meaningful amends to the community you have harmed. Collins sat motionless, the color drained from his face as he realized the full extent of his punishment. His attorney was already preparing appeal paperwork, but they both knew the evidence was overwhelming. Mr. Collins, Judge Thompson concluded, you came into this courtroom believing your wealth and status placed you above the law. You leave it today understanding that justice applies equally to everyone. This court sincerely hopes you use this experience as an opportunity for genuine change. He picked up his gavel. You have 30 days to begin implementing these penalties. This court will maintain oversight to ensure full compliance. Should you fail to meet any of these requirements, you will face additional sanctions, including possible jail time. The gavel struck with finality. Court is adjourned. As people began to rise, several of Collins's tenants burst into applause, quickly silenced by Officer Martinez. Judge Thompson gathered his papers, his face showing no emotion but his eyes reflecting satisfaction in a justice well served. Collins remained seated, staring blankly ahead as his attorney explained the appeal process. But everyone in the courtroom knew they had witnessed something significant, a powerful reminder that in a court of law, true justice knows no boundaries of wealth, status, or race. 6 months after Judge Thompson's landmark ruling, the impact of the case continued to ripple through Miami's legal and real estate communities. The Morning Miami Herald's headline read, Collins' case leads to sweeping changes in housing court procedures. The community service requirement had profoundly affected Collins. Working alongside the very people he once discriminated against opened his eyes to realities he had previously ignored. At the local housing advocacy center, he found himself helping elderly residents navigate rental agreements, the same type of documents he had once used to confuse and intimidate tenants. Judge Thompson's ruling had become required reading in Miami law schools. Professor James Chen at the University of Miami Law School incorporated the case into his civil rights curriculum, using it as a prime example of how the justice system could effectively address both individual misconduct and systemic discrimination. The $500,000 legal aid fund, now known as the Fair Housing Justice Fund, had already helped dozens of low-income tenants fight against negligent landlords. Maria Rodriguez, a former Collins tenant who had suffered through years of ignored maintenance requests, now served on the fund's advisory board. In the courthouse, new protocols had been established for handling discriminatory behavior. Signs in multiple languages now informed people of their rights and the consequences of showing contempt for court proceedings. Judge Thompson's measured response to Collins's outburst became a training example for new judges. The monthly inspections of Collins's properties revealed dramatic improvements. The court-appointed administrator had replaced faulty wiring, fixed structural issues, and installed proper fire safety systems. Tenants reported a complete transformation in living conditions and management responsiveness. Local news stations ran follow-up stories showing the renovated buildings. One elderly resident, tears in her eyes, showed reporters her new working elevator, something she had requested for 3 years under Collins's management. "Now I can visit my grandchildren without fear of being trapped in the stairwell," she said. Collins's public apologies, published in 3 major newspapers, sparked conversations about accountability in the real estate industry. Other property managers, fearing similar scrutiny, began proactively addressing maintenance issues and reviewing their anti-discrimination policies. The sensitivity training programs that Collins attended had an unexpected effect. He began speaking at real estate conferences about his experience, warning others about the costs of discrimination and the importance of treating all tenants with respect. Though some viewed his transformation skeptically, housing advocates noted that his story served as a powerful deterrent to others in the industry. Judge Thompson's chambers received letters from judges across the country, requesting details about how he handled the case. His approach to addressing both individual misconduct and systemic issues became a model for other courts dealing with similar situations. The case also led to changes in local building inspection procedures. The City Council passed the Thompson Protocol, requiring more frequent inspections of rental properties and establishing stricter penalties for code violations. The days of landlords easily avoiding consequences for safety violations were over. 1 year after the ruling, Collins completed his community service hours. The experience had changed him. He was often seen at community meetings, quietly sitting in the back, listening to residents' concerns. His attorney remarked that he had become a different person, more thoughtful, more aware of his impact on others. The legal profession took notice too. The American Bar Association featured the case in their journal, praising Judge Thompson's balanced approach to justice. His handling of Collins's racist behavior without letting it overshadow the underlying safety violations was particularly commended. In the end, the case became more than just a story about one disrespectful developer facing consequences. It transformed into a testament to the power of justice applied equally and fairly, regardless of wealth or status. The resolution demonstrated how the legal system could address both immediate wrongdoing and deeper societal issues. Judge Thompson continued his work on the bench, known now not just for his fair rulings but for his ability to turn moments of conflict into opportunities for positive change. When asked about the case, he simply said, "Justice isn't about revenge or punishment, it's about correction and growth." The courthouse halls, once witness to Collins's dramatic display of disrespect, now saw a different kind of traffic. People inspired by the case, seeking justice with the confidence that they would be heard, regardless of their background or resources.